Hi. We are going to talk about schizophrenia spectrum and psychotic disorders. Okay. So first, I want to talk a little bit about negative versus positive symptoms. Um, these are how symptoms are kind of clustered together based on how they impact the person's premorbid, which just means before they develop schizophrenia, personality or um, functioning. Um, Positive symptoms are things that are added to the person's premorbid personality. So hallucinations, delusions, disorganized thoughts are more active and out there. And then negative symptoms are taken away from that person's premorbid personality. So flat affect, anhedonia, I just don't want to do anything. Social withdrawal, alogia, avolition, meaning I don't I don't want to do anything. Anhedonia, more I just don't care. I don't have any particular there is no joy. And then cognitive impairment. Um, Old meds tended to work pretty well on positive symptoms most of the time, but not very well at all on negative symptoms. As a matter of fact, some would make those worse. So newer medications do a little bit better job on negative symptoms. Um, but so to understand those two. So let's talk about the basic um, kinds of positive symptoms. So, delusions are false beliefs despite evidence. So, they can be delusions of control, of persecution, thought insertion, um, paranoid delusions, erotomanic, believing somebody is in love with me or that we have a relationship that we don't, delusions of reference, um, somatic delusions. So those are, you can't argue someone out of those. They are, by definition, false beliefs in spite of any amount of evidence. I just believe this is the way it is. Hallucinations are distorted perceptions. They can be in any sense, but the most common are auditory, followed by visual hallucinations. Schizophrenia has many different presentations. Uh, they used to be used to differentiate different types of subtypes kind of schizophrenia in previous diagnostic and statistical manuals. So there was paranoid schizophrenia, which uh, tended to have less cognitive impact in terms of they were still able to organize their thoughts and do something, which sometimes can be dangerous. Um, but the character of that disorder was more about paranoia, so a belief that somebody was out after me or wanted to harm me. Um, Disorganized was another kind of classification, which was uh, presented in many different ways, but thoughts being really disorganized and generally not able to pull themselves together. They might, that might be represented in speech with uh, clanging or different kinds of speech that are really hard to make sense of. Um, Catatonic schizophrenia. So that is a condition where a person is just completely still, um, and you can move their body parts and they don't really respond like you would move a doll. They just have a very flat affect, um, staring forward, and you can pose them however. That is catatonia, undifferentiated, etc. Our diagnostic system now kind of clumps all those together, um, and then you describe the symptoms. A word about our diagnostic system. Um, uh, our current diagnostic, and the one that has gone through, it's now in its fifth iteration and a revision of that. Um, it diagnoses by symptom, by what you see, and you take that group of symptoms, and that becomes the disorder. Um, there is a push with PET scans and all of that now to get to a place where you can where we could diagnose based on an actual description of processes. Um, there was an effort when the DSM-5 came out. There were efforts moving forward, and still are, to develop a system called the RDoc, which does that, would go back and look at actual processes and cluster those into categories, and those would become the labels. That is not what the DSM is. The DSM is about, and it's pretty a pretty blunt tool. It just groups based on symptoms. So it's kind of like if I had a runny nose, that runny nose could be because of an allergy. It could be because I have COVID. It could be because I have some other cold or whatever. It's as if then we just said, oh, you have runny nose. That's kind of the level at which our diagnostic system is. Not because the disorders aren't real. Um, it's just hard to, when you, unlike other parts of the body that you can look at, you haven't until PET scans and in the relatively recent past been able to really watch. So we had to kind of go by symptoms. So um, the current DSM does not specify by type, is the bottom line there. Negative symptoms and the cognitive impairment are the most disabling parts of schizophrenia or psychosis. Um, on the next slide, we're going to talk about cognitive impairments to include decreased reasoning, processing speed, attention, auditory and or visual processing and memory, reasoning, problem solving. Um, Cognitive symptoms tend to be the first ones to emerge. So long before someone has these positive symptoms, you will see cognitive impairment. So processing speed, that is the greatest impairment and predictor of outcomes. I've heard people describe it like going through life swimming through peanut butter. Like I can see the world, I can see what's going on, but it's just like there is a huge fog between me and the rest of the world, and I'm moving really slowly. Executive functioning, that's higher level processing, such as organization, planning, conceptual flexibility, inhibition, which is a huge part of cognition, is inhibiting really more than facilitating, and then problem solving. episodic or working memory. So episodic memory is that memory of past events. Um, and working memory kind of holds information and uses it to accomplish tasks. Verbal fluency, so the ability to retrieve verbal information. And then social cognition, so basic social cue perception, taking the perspective of others, being able to think about kind of what is that other person feeling, emotional regulation, and empathy are all cognitive impairments. And again, those cognitive impairments tend to happen first um, in psychotic disorders or in particular in schizophrenia. And so what you're going to see are impacts with if they are school age in the ability to do schoolwork, often in ADLs, an tendency to withdrawal and be isolating. Um, all of those are kind of early symptoms. So, but next thing we got to talk about is psychosis happens outside of schizophrenia as well. And I want to talk just briefly about kind of where it happens and how you differentiate that. So this is a graph of bipolar 1 disorder. So if you look, it goes all the way up into mania and all the way down into depression. Um, when someone has a mood disorder, they can become psychotic when they are up in mania or when they're way down in depression. Um, that is different than, and this is a depressive disorder. So rocking along typically, and then come all the way down into depression. Again, that being in this area uh, that is in the depressed state, it is not at all uncommon for people to have psychosis. Often there, it's very negative content. Um, and then up here in mania also tends to be kind of more florid and grandiose, but also having uh, delusional thoughts are not uncommon up here. Doesn't, not so much in hypomania or in dysthymia. In hypomania, sleep kind of goes out, might kind of start getting really irritable with almost a frenetic quality, but they still have a grasp on reality. Same with dysthymia, coming down here above depression, below kind of typical mood. Irritability is often the first kind of sign there too. Kind of more hopeless, but not um, still able to distinguish reality from not reality, um, which goes away in depression. Bipolar 2 is rocking along in normal or normal, typical kind of mood range, and then coming up to into hypomanic, so not delusional up here, and then going all the way down into depression. I didn't make that line quite low enough. Um, all the way down into depression. Um, then they may have some psychosis down in this depression, but not all the way up here. Sometimes that's a little harder to distinguish. So this light blue line represents kind of our typical, got good days, bad days, I'm in a good mood, not so great. Um, that typical kind of range doesn't mean that I'm a monolith. I'm just kind of, good days, bad days. I'm not moving all the way up into hypomania and then mania or all the way down into depression. The two important states when you're working with somebody with bipolar or depression is for them to really become very familiar with this dysthymic and hypomanic mood states, because that's where they still have a good grasp on reality and can make choices that will help get them some help so that they can not go all the way into mania or depression. So, schizophrenia is a different differential diagnosis, meaning that the doc rules out a mood disorder. If that person demonstrates psychosis, but then they give them a mood stabilizer and they get them into this typical range and the psychosis goes away, that's a mood disorder. In schizophrenia, they sometimes will look kind of depressed because of those negative symptoms. Um, but uh, uh, even when their mood is stable, the delusions and hallucinations are still there. Now, another differential diagnosis, someone who has either bipolar 1 or 2, but even when they get their mood relatively stable, they still have delusions. Um, and hallucinations. That's called a schizoaffective disorder. So affective being the mood component, and schizo the psychosis. So a schizoaffective, and that is when they're even when they can get their mood controlled, they still have some persistent delusions. They tend to have less negative symptoms and less cognitive impairment. They have more positive kind of symptoms. So, etiology. How does this happen? And I'm going to use some of my family. So, it could be genetics. There is a genetic predisposition. In people with negative symptoms, there is decreased gray matter. It could be excessive pruning. Adolescence to early to mid 20s is a common um, period of time for at least a subtype of schizophrenia. And I'm saying a subtype. Um, they aren't differentiated that way. However, the reality is schizophrenia is just it's just symptoms. And there are probably a number of different disorders within this larger kind of category that we're just not able to differentiate between. But um, in people with a lot of negative symptoms, there's decreased gray matter. So remember, in adolescence, there is a typical kind of process where we prune um, uh, connections in the brain for efficiency. Um, and a belief is that it could be that there's just excessive pruning that happens. Um, there is hypofrontality is another kind of thing that has been observed, and that might be due to decreased blood flow to the frontal lobe. Um, and then there is the hypotheses around, there are the hypotheses around dopamine, that increased dopamine causes schizophrenia, whereas decreased dopamine is associated with Parkinson's. Um, the diathesis stress uh, theory states that um, probably there is a predisposition, a genetic or genetic predisposition, and then you add stress on top of that, and that's what pushes people into expressing the illness. Um, so talking about my family a little bit, um, I had a great great uncle, great great uncle, my grandmother's brother, who kind of all of his life lived out on a little piece of the farm and did his thing. He was very asocial. Um, when he was bad, which is what they how they referred to it, his sisters would come and bring him food because he couldn't get out of bed. Didn't do anything. He just kind of sat. Um, and when you look forward to the next couple of generations I'm going to talk to you about, I kind of look back and I think he probably had schizophrenia. It wasn't diagnosed back then. Um, and he could kind of function with a lot of support by his siblings, but that would speak to some genetic possibility here. My brother had a pretty typical presentation, or classic maybe presentation of schizophrenia, in that it hit in that window between in adolescence and early 20s for him. He had really severe dyslexia. So that is a lot of stress in school. Um, he had had a head injury, so that is another stressor, physical stressor, but it's still a stressor. He had had a head injury, a pretty significant head injury as a young child. Um, and then you hit adolescence, you've got that pruning going on, and he began to kind of withdraw, um, use drugs, some probably more around masking, trying to self-medicate, but began to withdraw and um, uh, but still not we did not recognize, and we didn't know anything about mental illness, but we didn't recognize what was going on. Um, so he went into the military and well, first he went off to college and didn't hear from him. And he and I were close. So we talked regularly, didn't hear from him for a while, and went up to get him. And he was really paranoid, kind of curled up in a ball in the corner of his apartment. So gathered him, brought him back home. We still didn't have a lot of understanding of mental illness at that point, um, but brought him home. He decided to go into the military, which was a spectacularly bad idea. But to get that structure and all, we were raised in the Army, so it was kind of our familiar. He decided to go in the military. The Marines pretty quickly figured out something was off and kicked him out. The Army took him in probably because my dad was an Army officer. Um, but they kind of figured out before too long that something was up with him. And his unit was going over to Germany for exercises, and we had grown up largely in Germany, so he wanted to go, and his commanding officer said, "Not a good idea. You're going to stay here, Vocal," which last name. And he instead managed to get kind of squirrel himself into the unit and go over to Europe with them, where he promptly went AWOL. And he would call me with these wild tales about people coming to get him. And I was a hairdresser. I had zero pull with anybody anywhere. He was just calling me with these fantastic stories. And I had no idea what was going on. They finally got him back. And that's a whole nother long story, but he had schizophrenia, kind of more classic, but not a lot of cognitive, um, he didn't have a lot of negative symptoms, a little bit, but not a lot. He still was able to process thoughts. He had persistent delusions all of his life, um, and uh, hallucinations. Um, he just learned not to share them. So the kid in the gray shirt, the only colored picture, the little boy with the white shirt and shorts was Scotty, my brother, when he was little. And then he is the Cub Scout there too. The colored picture there is my oldest son, and his was very different. His father also had schizophrenia. Didn't understand that either because I had him very young. Um, his father also had schizophrenia. Um, he began to have symptoms in early childhood, which is somewhat atypical. Um, we did not understand anything about that diathesis stress theory and the idea that you needed to reduce stress. Um, so he had also really significant learning disabilities. It kind of runs in my family. And school was an enormous stressor. And he was also having hallucinations. And then again in adolescence, when those hormones dropped in, everything just kind of deteriorated significantly. Um, uh, he ended up having a mood disorder and a um, thought disorder. So that would be a schizoaffective disorder. It's probably the most accurate diagnosis for him. Um, so uh, uh, he was he did not have the as much cognitive impairment, um, so able to think and problem solve and go through, but he still had hallucinations and delusions that persisted his entire life. So, so prevalence and course. So we talked a little bit about that prodromal period, um, which is the period before, and that's where you tend to see more negative symptoms, more withdrawal. Um, Rates of schizophrenia tend to be pretty stable across cultures. The cognitive decline is generally first. Um, Early intervention, early intervention is about kind of decreasing stress levels, increasing coping, really teaching families and environments how to kind of keep things at a just right challenge, and teaching him coping strategies, or them, she or him, um, uh, coping strategies. Um, if you can catch them in that prodromal phase, and that'll be later in the semester and in lab, if you can catch them in that prodromal phase, you can, for a significant number of people, prevent their even developing schizophrenia, which is a really pretty remarkable thing. Um, uh, Thinking about health and well-being, people with schizophrenia die about 25 years sooner than the rest of us. They are often obese because the medicines cause weight gain. Um, and again, sometimes they're more effective on positive symptoms than negative. So they tend to be more sedentary and have a harder time getting themselves going. They tend to very frequently live in poverty. This is not always the case. There are some really remarkable examples of people with schizophrenia who are extremely successful, but the larger majority um, tend to live with poverty because if you live on Social Security, poverty is how you're living. There tends to be a lot of stigma. My brother was actually murdered when he was uh, 36 years old. He had gone to stay with a a friend on his way. He loved history. He could tell you more about Prussian wars than you ever wanted to know. Um, and so he had gone to stay with a friend of his on his way to the University of Kansas because he had been accepted there to pursue a degree in history. So excited. So he stopped by John's house in Oklahoma City and uh, was helping him out as they had a bouncer in his bar so he could earn some cash on his way up to school. And that happened to be Valentine's. And so he and his friend went out for drinks on Valentine's and left the friend's girlfriend at home. And she was furious. We can talk about where I think she falls, but it's not in this category. Um, she was furious. She got gun out of one cabinet, bullets out of another, put them together, and sat on the couch and waited for them to come home. He walked in the door. She was screaming at him. He ignored her, which is what he would have done because he didn't really perceive social cues like the rest of us. What we believe is that he was going in to tell his friend John, who was asleep, that he was leaving. And she fired, and the gun misfired. And then she fired again and shot him in the back of the head. When he went to court, all of this about stigma, when she went to court, a jury of 12 people decided that given in Oklahoma, what was called the Make My Day law that had just been passed, um, that the fact that she said that he was weird and creepy um, was reason enough for her to be afraid of him and and therefore excuse her killing him. Um, Again, stigma. That would not happen if I were shot. It wouldn't happen that way. So there's also self-stigma, which is when people internalize those negative messages. We'll learn coping strategies in lab for that. So resources for more information. Um, on our own, Judy Chamberlain was a person with postpartum psychosis who was hospitalized. Back in the day, people would be locked into institutions for years because of psychosis. So that is a seminal book, a short little one, but a seminal book about the kind of patient rights movement. And yeah. And then my son and I have written a book that came out this year in 25. And so I put it there for you. Um, A Beautiful Mind. Some of you may have seen the movie. That book is about a scientist, an esteemed scientist, who uh, uh, also had schizophrenia. And then Ragan's Journey Beyond the Frontier he is a psychiatrist, and it is a marvelous kind of much thicker read than the others, but a marvelous journey into that. So hopefully this helped. Thanks.